Today, what I want to do is I'm going to look at doorways and or the doorstep. So it's really looking at doorways in Pompeii, but it's I want to take a bit of a broader sweep of looking at Pompeii itself. Like we all sort of feel that we sort of know Pompeii and how this is a nice reconstruction of what Pompeii may have looked like, but I'm sure the landscape around it is in a very sort of idealized fashion. And at the same time, looking at the front part that's just beside yourselves, that's not really realistic. Um, so we know where Pompeii is in terms of Peninsula Italy, but just in case you don't, like I've been to Pompeii a few times myself, but I've never actually seen that red star. But it's another reason to go back to Pompeii in my point of view. But this might seem a little bit of a weird image. Now, this might give you an indication as my own sort of youth. But Pompeii is really all about layers. And if you don't know what I mean about layers and ogres, this is but like onions. That didn't really work too well, that joke. But I want to go and say that Pompeii is like ogres. That's what I want to say, and then people would know what the reference was. So anyway, it is about layers. So although I'm going to be looking and talking about myth of the doorways in some of the dwellings of Pompeii, I'm going to try and show you some of those layers and some of the issues in relation to those layers. So it's not trying to make it more complex. It's just to give you an indication of why some evidence exists and some indication as to why other evidence doesn't exist. So this is a nice image, nice colorful image. Now you can see the bits in white are those areas that haven't been excavated. So there's still quite a large proportion of Pompeii that hasn't been excavated. But hopefully this gives you a reasonable sort of self-explanatory image. But the colors here represent periods of excavation. So much about what I'm going to be talking to you about tonight is what I've indicated here with the red arrow is, 1879 to 1923. So this is the area that I'm going to be looking at predominantly, but I'm going to jump a little bit out because, I tend to digress quite a bit in some ways. But this is a period when there's good the start of photographic evidence. The earlier position before that previous time, the excavation reports weren't as great. So this explains in some cases why I'm looking at the area I'm looking at and perhaps trying to suggest and extrapolate that this might have been the case elsewhere in Pompeii, but I'm trying to look at the physical evidence itself. So this is one of the dwellings we're going to be looking at, the House de Fabii, which doesn't look very spectacular. Um, Here another one, the Casa of Cornelius Maximus, and I think like, well, this is a little bit of a boring doorway. Maybe just Ardle's obsessed with rectangles, and the House of the beautiful Impluvium. So this is how you would see Pompeii today, and this is very much how most of us will imagine what Pompeii is like. Now, the point I want to make here and bring in the sort of one of those areas in terms of layers is Pompeii is full of color. Now, a lot of those colors have been lost. This is one of the more recent excavations here from, as I said, because I'll forget what the dates is, 2019 to 21. This is one of those electoral graffitis. But let's move into areas that I sort of quite like, and some of you will have seen me showing this before. This is a shop counter that exists in Pompeii. For those of you that have visited Pompeii, will see some of the shop counters that have been preserved, but this is a more recent. You can see the vivid colors that exist here. Just to give you an example of these vivid colors, and again, probably just to go back into my obsession about looking at retail establishments and shop counters, you can see that this is an impressive drawing. Like it's something that's put into a shop that they wouldn't have probably put a lot of money into in relation to the decoration, but you can still see it's very striking. So I'm trying to make this point in relation to a lot of the dwelling facades would have been quite ornate, and some of the images I'm going to show you will be in black and white, so they don't really get an impression of those dramatic colors, those tantalizing colors. That's one of the reasons I'm showing that. Also, a nice picture of a dog. Um, and again, some things that people would have seen around them. You can see that, this is quite an impressive image of a cockerel or a chicken. So when I'm trying to show you these colors, these images, I want you to try and imagine some of the colors that might have existed. So even today, those that have been preserved that we can see today, apart from the ones I've just shown you, have been dulled quite a lot through time, but really through sun damage. They're covered in what's that sort of plasticky thing? Not PVC, but you sort of lose some of those colors through that opaque protection of these colors. So the first dwelling I threatened I'd show you would be the House of the Fabi. And looking at this image here, you can see nothing's too dramatic, but you can see there's two little roofs. Now, those two little roofs is what I'm going to draw your attention to. The location of that. Now, I think I can. We'll be able to go and draw a little bit of a drawing here if I can. Um, what would be a nicer color? So let's go with a more regal purple and a bigger size marker. It's along this street here. This street here is the Via de Abadanza and the Street of Abundance. And this is really what I'm going to focus on. This is one of the main thoroughfares in Pompeii, leading to the Pompeian Forum, which is located over here. So the continuation of the Via de Abadanza here. So much of the excavations that took place here is in 1911, 1912, 1913. So as I said to you, I want to draw your attention to here and here. Now, looking at this, you can see this rather odd blockage here, which shows you that this dwelling hasn't been fully excavated. In fact, it hasn't been excavated at all. Now, the person who was excavating this area of the Via de Abadanza is a person called Spinzola, and he was very interested in dwelling facades. So that's literally what he did. It was a quick excavation along this road, and a lot of some of the dwellings were excavated, more impressive ones, but this one wasn't excavated. So what do I want to draw attention to? Now, I mentioned a little bit in terms of the color. Now, this is an image that comes from 1961, and you can see that there's quite a bit of color here. It's a checkerboard pattern. And in this case, I think you can see it's sort of red, yellow, and white color. Now, this would have also existed in the whole of the facade. So it would have been quite impressive in terms of that decoration. Certainly, I find it quite striking, but you can see very little of that has been preserved for us today. But this is an image, a photograph that was taken in 1915, and you can see the checkerboard pattern on either side of the actual doorway, but you can also see these figures here. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. Now, in most cases, when we talk about and looking at Pompeii, we're quite well used to the sort of red color, the lower part, and the upper part of it is white, which is correct. But the point I'm trying to make also is there's much more color and much more images in relation to the upper part of the facade. And that's what I want to focus on. That's what I think is interesting. So what are these images? So looking at the left-hand side, we have this image, and this has been interpreted as being Romulus. Now, I probably don't have to tell you much about who Romulus is, but Romulus was the early founder of Pompeii. And you can see here he's been presented in, I wouldn't say a modern way, but certainly in the Roman period in terms of this statuary, sort of dramatic, what you would expect one of the emperors to wear in terms of a breastplate. You can see he's a victorious individual because he's carrying a trophy over his shoulder. And this would have been quite a dramatic image as somebody is entering into the actual dwelling itself. On the left-hand side, a reconstruction in terms of some of the colorization of it, which I think is quite pretty and quite nice, but it probably would have been much more striking at the original time when it was excavated. But I've made the point about the colors and the recent excavation, but these would have been exposed in their own contemporary period, so they would have dulled over time, and some of these might have got painted over. On the right hand side, you have another image. You can see very little has been preserved. It's a shame, but we have this image here. We have Aeneas, his father, and his son walking towards a doorway. Romulus is also walking towards a doorway. So we've got these very strong, and I would suggest very strong Romanized images on either side of the door, which wouldn't sound too surprising when we're thinking about this is Pompeii, part of the Roman Empire. But Pompeii, a century beforehand, a little bit less than that, revolt. No, actually, about more than a century, revolted against Rome, and was occupied and defeated by Sulla. Sulla took over the place and ultimately made it into a colony and settled Romans in this place. But this is a very Romanized image, um, which might be reflecting that transition, but perhaps not so much. Underneath the image, here you can see this graffiti, um, which I don't. It's great that people can actually read this. Is you can see as I'm sort of giving you a voiceover. I sing o' fullers and an owl, not of arms and a man. So the suggestion is that this has been written there in and makes the point that the dwelling itself, or maybe one of the adjacent shops on the right hand side, was part of a fuller's establishment. Now, it hasn't been fully excavated, but the image itself here, the graffiti here doesn't seem to be striking enough to me. I think it's just some random person wrote it on the wall. So I don't think that this is necessarily linked to the dwelling itself, but it has been interpreted as being near enough a humorous quote to Virgil's Aeneid. So that might reaffirm that connection to that Romanization, Virgil's Aeneid being that sort of early sort of background story to the establishment of Augustus. The owl, as it says here, is linked to Minerva. Minerva is obviously something that's very important to Rome as one of the three main Capitoline triads, along with Juno and Jupiter. And the owl is connected with Minerva. So it's quite a nice idea, but I'm not so sure about it myself. Now, in terms of dating in relation to this is dated as the fourth style of decoration. As you can imagine, this is one of the last styles of decoration based upon studies in Pompeii, earlier scholars in relation to that, but more closely related to AD 72, based upon one electoral graffiti um, daubing, shall we say, on the wall. So it's at the latter part, and this is what people would have seen just before the eruption. Actually, they probably would have seen Vesuvius erupting more than anything else, but hopefully you know what I'm suggesting to you in relation to that. Now, I'm making the point about that being related to Augustus, but Augustus passed away in AD 14. But at this stage, the sort of Augustan ideology, Aeneas is really sort of capsulized, not just about Rome and Augustus, but becomes the embodiment of the whole idea of the Roman Empire. And it has been, if and we've also gone outside the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and here we have an image of Titus. Titus is the emperor, the Flavian dynasty that's taken over from the Julio-Claudian dynasty. But if we move to the Forum in Pompeii, we can see this is the temple of Vespasian, but also linked in to the Genus of Augustus. So you can see the culmination almost of that imperial cult. So perhaps the owners of this dwelling is not necessarily thinking of their Romanization and broader element of the Roman Empire, but linking itself to the very core of Pompeii and the political structure and the religious structure of Pompeii. So it has that sort of dual deference, that local deference, but also that wider and sort of imperial way of looking at things. The temple itself is not very impressive. You've got this walls here. So the most impressive part of it is really the interior element. We can see the altar there, and some of the elements that were found within. So perhaps we can link that these imperial images from that doorway to this very central part of the city of Pompeii itself. And that's what I made the point about telling you a little bit earlier on about the Via de Abbondanza connected directly to the forum itself. And this is its location. If you use the drawing itself, this is, as I said to you, the Via de Abbondanza, following on to that pattern. Not, it's a bit of a drunken way of doing it, but in relation to the forum in Pompeii. I did put an image of it. So possible, just making that connection between this singular dwelling and that of the former in Pompeii, but reiterating the point, we've no idea what's going on or what went on in the interior of this dwelling because it hasn't been fully excavated. So I'm very much looking at the exterior of this dwelling and trying to find links elsewhere in Pompeii. there is one dwelling near the Forum in Pompeii that is called the House of Romulus, but it's because of statues. I found a few images interior, but nothing exterior seems to be similar to this. The other dwelling I want to look at, and this goes back into my point about layers, is the house of Cornelius Maximus, which is located a little bit further down the Via de Abbondanza. I've put it in here in red. The previous one is there in sort of a yellow color. So we're getting a little bit closer to the center of Pompeii itself. Again, you can see some elements have just been barely preserved. But now looking at in the black and white image, you've got these odd images here of these sort of shaded figures. Now, again, as in the other case, you can see that it hasn't been fully excavated. There's probably a shop located here and another shop located here. But I'm just looking at the flanks entering into the dwelling. So you can see that's been covered. Perspex, that's the word I was looking for, that perspex cover. Unfortunately, because of the sun damage in relation, it's very difficult to see what's behind it. But you can see, just get a little bit of an image of what has actually been preserved. So this is the early photograph of it, and it looks a little bit complex in relation to that. But this goes back to the point I made a little bit about layers. In fact, this image here of this figure is the earlier image. And there were, in fact, three different layers of image. This is another image that was preserved within this one. This was the earliest phase, as far as I can remember. We have this character, not very clear, but you can see what looks like, at a guess, is a club, perhaps some sort of a cloth of an animal. So the suggestion is this is actually an image of Hercules. And the other image we have here is a nice, probably maybe a fat dog. It looks a little bit like a bumblebee actually, but it's a pig. So we often get images of Hercules like this with a pig in terms of lararium, which is domestic cults within dwellings. But this is something on the exterior of this image of this dwelling itself. So we've got these three different layers. So the owner of this house, or the owners of this house, went through different phases in what they wanted to represent on the right hand side of this doorway. Minerva being the oldest one, the image of Hercules I showed you, this image here, and then Hercules with a pig being the youngest one. So how might we interpret that? We can make various interpretations. One is it might have been change in ownership, or perhaps maybe changes in the ideals of what people wanted to focus on and commemorate in relation to this dwelling, and what they want to have sort of represent as their identity to those that are walking by on the Via de Abbondanza. So that's the right hand side. We can also see another image on the left hand side. On this left-hand side, again, very little of it has been preserved. But again, we have this sort of image that is not necessarily fully clear. But in terms of, and there only seems to be a single image in relation to, in this case. And this again seems to be an image of Hercules. So it's perhaps in its latest phase. Now, admittedly, the image of Minerva is the one that's much more colorful, the one that I think is more impressive in terms of display. Now, maybe they didn't have as much money in relation to this. They decided, or they just wanted a quick image. But it's interesting that they should have a doorway that's flanked on either side by Hercules. So why Hercules? Now you might think about, well, why is Ardle showing me this image here? One of the reasons why I'm showing you this image, because I think it's quite dramatic, and that's what I'm trying to do, is impress you. But this is a temple in what's known as the Triangular Forum in Pompeii. Now the Triangular Forum has this, well, here's where it actually is it has a Doric temple. Now this temple itself is quite impressive. Unfortunately, very little has been preserved in relation to what it looked like above. It's an area that not many people go to in Pompeii. It's located, this is the Doric style temple that it is. And you might think, well, why is he talking about a Doric style temple? It's just giving you an impression of the antiquity of this. It's not following the tradition Roman style temple. So this is something previous to the Roman colonization. It's the oldest part of Pompeii. The wall here in the back, this is the theater in Pompeii. So just to giving you an image, most people who are visiting Pompeii are more interested in looking at the theatre itself. You can see it's quite a nice, pleasant area, and the triangular form here. Now, the temple itself is dedicated to Hercules. It's also dedicated to Athena, which later becomes Minerva. So I think it's quite interesting. This household here has representations of the real sort of early deities that are being presented in early part of Pompeii. Now, you might think it's interesting that I'm talking about Athena, but it goes back into that sort of um, Samnite or Oscan connection of Pompeii. There is, some of you might know about Paestum, which is a little bit further south. There's a large temple to Athena there. There's another temple to Athena. So again, showing that interesting connection. Now, as I said to you in relation to the first dwelling, Minerva is one of the Capitoline triad that's located as worshipped over here. But still, this is the early temple in Pompeii. So why would Hercules be important? And perhaps why might somebody transfer over to moving away from Minerva to Hercules? Hercules is believed to have been one of the earlier founders of Pompeii. You can imagine Herculaneum, Herculano, that has that connection, that early connection with Hercules. But Hercules was roaming around this place quite a bit. And there is a story in relation to this is just giving you an impression of, this is, I want to try and show you that, remember I showed you the earlier image, that this is an impressive temple that would have been very visual to those that are traveling along the coastline, the Amalfi coastline here, or up the river into the Sarno River beside Pompeii. And this just gives you an impression of, how high the temple is located in this area up here, about how high it is, about 10 meters away. Now, this is an image that perhaps comes from an altar lararium in one of the dwellings, and it relates to an earthquake perhaps the earthquake in 62. So what is the connection of this in relation to Hercules? There is a story that one of the things that Hercules did was there were some unruly giants that lived under the earth near Pompeii, and Hercules' role was to defeat these giants. So perhaps as a result of the earthquake in 62, now this is the big earthquake, but there would have been other tremors that are taking place. And it's well known from looking at the literary sources that tremors did take place. So perhaps the occupants of this household decided, like, maybe they should have a sort of a good luck token, a dual aspect of having Hercules on either side of the doorway because of tremors that were taking place, perhaps. Unfortunately, we don't know, but it's just a suggestion and making a link to those tremors and those earthquakes and Hercules himself. Now, this is not just a once-off in relation to images that are being sort of painted over or being totally removed. This one here, the Casa dell'Arcara Rossa, is basically the House of the Red Anchor. Now you can see in the image I'm showing you here, there's a few little dots. There's a little bit further up, moving further to the east of the Via de Abbondanza, and it's not very impressive street, but you can facade, but you can see the little dots here on the plaster. And these are here to help, put a new layer of plaster on this. Now, this was excavated, as it says here, in 1913. And it's not sort of great images of, but you can see that even in this image here, you can see that there are different layers, even in this electoral painting that exists there. So when Matteo della Corte excavated this site, it says that an old plaster of a red anchor was lost during frost. Now, that's got nothing to do with mythological images, but I think the anchor itself is significant from the broader things I've been talking about, that Pompeii itself has a very strong maritime connection. That's something I'm going to talk about, but really the point I want to do is go back into my onions thing and my failed joke in relation to Shrek about those layers. So an awful lot of stuff. These images has been lost, but a lot of these images or these facades probably had quite a history, a layered history that has not been noticed or been lost through the earlier excavations. The anchor itself might be linked to the shop here on the right hand side. We don't know, but this is one of the difficulties when we're looking at these old excavation reports, is that we often don't know the proximity in relation to the doorway. So normally what I'm looking at when I'm looking at these images in relation to doorways, if the characters are facing or walking, they should be walking towards the doorway itself, sort of bringing that sort of good luck to the dwelling, and particularly in relation to looking at images of Mercury. But that's just my thoughts in relation to looking at these things. But again, it shows some of the difficulties trying to make those links. Now, perhaps the most spectacular doorway is looking at the house of the beautiful impluvium, or the casa of the six divinities. The six divinities is really what I want to focus on here. And it's located again on the Via de Abbondanza, but on the opposite side of the road, just to show that I'm willing to move around a little bit in Pompeii. It's a very grand doorway in terms of size. You can see there's a shop dwelling there over onto the left hand side. One of the things that's quite nice about this is the door. There has been a cast of the doorway that's actually been preserved here, which gives us an image of how the Pompeians secured themselves. Um, but really, what I want to focus on is this aspect. So there is this sort of wallway on the eastern side of the doorway of the facade, that they have quite an area to sort of do images that they wish. And as people are walking, you can probably just about make an image of a person moving towards from left to right, holding something in their hand. This is a black and white image of it, and you can see the suggestion is that this is Mercury. Mercury with his sort of traveler's hat, the things in his hand, they sort of bit look like wine jars, but these are supposed to be bags of money. On the left hand side, you see an image slightly darker, but you also see a pig. And the suggestion is this is Hercules. Now, Della Corte, he thought that another image would have been of Bacchus, but unfortunately, that all has been lost. On the other side, again, elements have been just about being preserved, but the black and white image gives us a clearer image of that. And you can see an image of a character on the left-hand side, a woman with a spear and a shield and looking like it's sort of doing some sort of offerings at the altar. And this appears to be Minerva. To her right-hand side, another character with a phoenix, and that's suggested that might actually be Juno. So you've got these two deities. I don't know who the other character was. The other character has been suggested might have been Venus, but really I don't know what the evidence for that is. But you've got these three important female deities, and the adjacent side you've got three important male deities. So it's interesting that there is this procession of deities in towards the dwelling. Now it's probably is intentional that Mercury is the one that's bringing the wealth into this dwelling itself, and you often see Mercury in a similar pose in a lot of retail dwellings, sort of bringing wealth into that household. Now the advantage of this particular dwelling is that it has been fully excavated, and over on the left hand side is the plan of that dwelling, and where it is located in the wider insula, the sort of city block. And there's nothing, by having a look in this dwelling, admittedly perhaps is lost, it seems to make a connection internally to these images of these six deities. So this goes back to the point I'm suggesting that people are trying to impress upon people that are going down the Via de Abbondanza. These are sort of external images. Now, yes, they might be personal images for the people within, but it does seem to be connected to that wider ideas, that sort of external ideas, which I hope to sort of bring together a little bit towards the end of this talk. Um, Moving a little bit away, or one of the things I should have mentioned, which I forgot, is that this house is undergoing renovation before the eruption and destruction by Vesuvius, and it seems that these 6 images have sort of gone out of taste or whatever. So perhaps there has been a change of ownership, and that might explain there's a little bit of truncation of it just in the doorway itself. So for whatever reason, the occupants of this dwelling decided they want to change the image that they're presenting to the people in front. Another dwelling a little bit further away, um, located on a more sort of peripheral street to the Via de Abadanza. You can just about make out the image here. And it's really this sort of getting to stage one to present you a little bit of eye candy. You can just about make out an image here of a male. It looks like perhaps he's holding a club. Above, you've got the strange head thing, and you've also got another male character that seems to be dressed up in some sort of ceremonial garb. So in this case, again, it seems to be different images transposing over each other. The male individual that you can see on the right-hand side has been suggested that's Hercules. The other image to his left is perhaps again it's somebody, a priest making some sort of sacrifice on an altar, and the head above it's been sort of floating head of Athena, perhaps, or Minerva. So you can see there's a bit of a difficulty in relation to the interpretation. And again, moving within this dwelling, trying to find images that might be related to this. This is the kitchen, and you can see within the kitchen there is a sort of a lararium, which is, sort of the household deities. You can see garlands here, and this is the closest I can find in relation to linking the interior of the dwelling. These are garlands here to the exterior image. So again, just more or less reiterating the point, there doesn't seem to be that implicit connection between the interior decoration to the exterior decoration that people are presenting to the front. Another dwelling, which is quite an impressive looking one, is this dwelling here, the Magic Rites Complex. Um, Again, in the sort of general area, but quite close to Via de Abadanza. Not much has been preserved, but you can see that there has been a bit of hacking, shall we say, in relation to the plaster. So the actual images themselves have been removed. And you can just about make the image here. And something I didn't sort of mention a little bit earlier, what is quite nice about looking at these images on either side of the doorways is they're framed by a sort of red band. So this is a colorized imager that's been taken, I think, in 1963. You can see clear image here, another clear image here on either side of the facade. There's also a charming one of a deity known as Priapus, but I'm going to focus on either side of the facade, which you'll understand why when I talk a little bit about Priapus. But what we have here is an image that's been interpreted as being Venus. She's sort of looking into a mirror. There is an image, there's a just about maybe on the left hand side, you can see a little bit of image of Cupid. But this is not just Venus, it's the Venus of Pompeii. And again, Venus is an important early character in relation to Pompeii, and that's why I mentioned Sulla a little bit earlier on. Sulla took on Venus as being like his patron deity. So it's not just Venus in its general, it's the Pompeian Venus. But as you'll remember from perhaps when reading in Virgil, that Venus is very important for the establishment and foundation of the city of Rome and the Roman Empire, because it's the mother of Aeneas, one of the other early founders of the city of Rome. So there, actually, that's where Cupid is on her shoulder. On the opposite side, perhaps hopefully you can make out, you can see this character. I can never remember what it's called, but like almost like a sort of aerial transmitter thing. But this is the sort of staff that Mercury carried along with him. And also you can see the money bag. And it's been suggested perhaps the character on his right hand side is Bacchus. I think there is sort of vine leaves and sort of grapes over there. But so two deities that are flanking either side. The image that why you might think it's Bacchus now, I can see this clearer image, is you can see what looks like a little cat, but it's not just a domestic cat. A cat is a panther, which is often connected with Bacchus. So my point is that Mercury is looking towards the doorway with the money bag, so bringing wealth and prosperity to this particular household. perhaps because we have the image of Venus, which links into the point I was trying to make about the red anchor, is that nautical, that maritime connection in relation to the occupants of Pompeii. So perhaps this is someone that might have had some connection. This is one of the reasons why I didn't dwell too much upon the image of Priapus, because there's two images flanking either side of the doorway. Priapus is well known for being very well endowed, and this chap is obviously making sure that's protected. But what is interesting about Priapus, there's one other good strong image of that, the house of oh, I forgot uh, the brothers. But Priapus is a protector of boundaries, so it's a protection of the doorway and the links in that doorway with boundaries. Yeah, I think that, Sean, that's right. That's the technical term. Thank you. Looking at another dwelling, a little bit further away. In this case, it's just trying to give you an impression. This is an early excavation of the dwelling that took place. Let me see, what was the date it took? Yeah, 1867. Now, unfortunately, nothing has been preserved except the written text. And in this case, on the left hand has been suggested that Hercules existed. On the right hand side was Mercury. So again, reiterating that point about Hercules, but again, reiterating that point I was saying to you about layers. And one of the unfortunate elements, these are not spectacular images. Like, they're spectacular to me, but really in the early excavations, they really were more impressed with the interior decorations. So they didn't really spend too much time in consideration of the facades, but at least this was recorded. The other thing that's quite nice about this particular dwelling was they did make a cast of the doorway. I showed you the image of the cast of the house of the six deities, but you can see the doorways themselves are probably quite ornate. So they were trying to impress and draw attention to the doorways and the facades of their individual dwellings. In this case, another dwelling a little bit further away, we can see two impressive images on either side of the doorway. On the right hand side is the one that I want to focus on, but before that, again, another image of Mercury walking towards the doorway. But on the right hand side, we've got this charming image of a ship. So, again, making that point about that maritime connection. Now, in this case, the images of the characters in the ship aren't very clear, but it's still quite a nice. In this case, it's quite a sort of a uh, back not backyard, but one of the back street areas, but they're still trying to make their area distinctive. Now, again, this has been fully excavated, but looking around the dwelling itself and looking at some of the preserved elements that are there, there doesn't seem to be that connection with the images in the front of the dwelling. Another one here, a little bit further, just quite close to the one that I showed you about the magic complex, but on the opposite side of the street. Again, you can see the rectangular part or the square part of the doorway has been removed of the plaster. Now, in this case, we have this image of a ship, but a large female character on the right hand side, on the left hand side, on the bow of the ship, or is it the stern? Um, but there was an inscription, or painted inscription, in the lower part, written in Greek, Venus the Savior. Now, I've shown this image before, and someone asked me, was that written as Venus in Greek or was it written as Aphrodite in Greek? I've tried to find the actual CIL number and the actual inscription, but haven't successfully found it yet. But that was a good question. So the suggestion is, what we have here is that image of Aphrodite or Venus, and that connection in relation to that deity. So I've mentioned to you earlier on the importance of Venus in relation to the earlier part of the establishment of the colony of Pompeii, but there is a temple of Venus in Pompeii. And this is located in the sort of far end of Pompeii. Again, a bit like the temple of Hercules and Athena, in quite a high position in relation to Pompeii. Not much of it has been preserved. It probably was quite an impressive temple. In this case, you can see it's more of a Roman style, so it's a later architectural development than the Doric temple that I showed you previously. But its location here on the sort of almost like a pinnacle almost of Pompeii, but it's on a quite a grand height. If we look you might just make out the word hore here, which are stores. So these would have been stores for goods that are coming into Pompeii or goods that are leaving Pompeii. So very much part of that commercial heart of Pompeii. But these are two significant temples, and certainly the Doric temple, the triangular forum, would have been very visible to people that are traveling down the Amalfi Coast. Oh, I don't know why that was there. So perhaps, this is just making those connections to some of those religious dwellings. So moving back into the Via de Abbondanza, I'm probably presenting too many images here. There is what's known as the Capitium, which is a domestic, or not a domestic shrine, a street shrine along Pompeii and the Via de Abbondanza. And you can see most of this, unfortunately, has been lost. You can see again here in red, the Compitium is very close to those four main dwellings that I said I was going to focus on in relation to this talk. Now, we know even nowadays that this was some sort of street shrine because we've got this altar here. Now, it doesn't look that impressive. And admittedly, the altar you can see here has been quite heavily reconstructed. It's also located quite close to a fountain. So this would have been a gathering point for an awful lot of people, not just in terms of religious aspects, but in the day-to-day elements. You can imagine people will be taking water to bring into the households or just drinking from these fountains more generally. But if you look closely at the wall, if it isn't just covered over nowadays, you can still see that there's some sort of colored aspects to it. There is one of my favorite images, which I know I'm digressing a little bit, of a nice shop sign here of some pots. And this is a nice looking shop over here. But you can just about make out a row of deities. And if we move into this sort of black and white image, I'm going to focus on this element here. But you can see again, sort of further religious images and other elements over here. These are like what I showed you in one of the earlier times. These are overlapping images. And so there was sort of some idea of change, a reconstruction of the facade that we're looking at here. But you can see it's very much the corner. Now, this is the 12 important deities that are related to sort of the main deities of Rome. And but one of those images show you can see a sort of little shrine. We can see this genus on either side and sort of perhaps also priests. But the main element I want to focus on is these characters here. You can just about make out some of these images from the photographs that were taken. Now, this is the black and white image, and putting those into order, you can see these the main deities that we'd be thinking about when we think about those deities in relation to the city of Rome and Rome itself. You can see Venus and Hercules and Minerva quite close together, which is perhaps quite significant. Now, I'm going to return to this image of Hercules a little bit later on, this image of Athena, but these are sort of these sort of the pinnacle deep. But you can see, looking at this image of Hercules here, it does seem to be quite close in terms of an image to the later phase and perhaps the middle phase in relation to the house of Cornelius Maximus, one of the first images that I showed you there. Perhaps. Now, it is a little bit of a tenuous connection, as I said, but they're very closely related to each other in terms of proximity. So maybe they were taking sort of inspiration, shall we say, from the Capitium. The other image that we can see, this is the earliest image in relation to Cornelius Maximus. You can see the image of Aphrodite here is quite close to the image of Aphrodite, not Aphrodite, Athena, Minerva in relation to the Capitium. Also, if you remember looking at the close image you can think of in relation to the house of the six deities, Athena there does seem to be showing this same sort of sacrificial pose. And as I said to you, the house of the six deities just across the road in relation to that. So perhaps the inspiration for the images in the house of the beautiful impluvium also come from this capitium. And just to make the point, you can see the house of the beautiful impluvium is just across the road. The compitium is was a sort of 9, 11, 1, which is the arrow here on the left hand side. So perhaps an interesting connection in relation to the capitium. Um, This does give the impression that this is quite a unique image, but there is another shrine of the 12 gods, the only other shrine to 12 gods in relation to Pompeii, and its location is quite close to the forum itself, but it's really on this side wall here. And it's a little bit of a back street, shall we say, in relation to, um, but it's alongside the Via de Abadanza, and the forum area is located here. So unfortunately, much of it has been lost, but you can see, going back into the earlier image I showed you of the colorized plan of Pompeii, you can see that it is part of those early excavations. And this is the area that I'm talking about in terms of the decay and what has been lost. You can just about make out a possibility of some heads. Now, I know I'm not very good at drawing, particularly with uh, uh, um, Adobe Connect, but hopefully you can just about make out some images of heads, the location of those. A little bit further on to the left, the right hand side of those images. But this is a reconstruction or a drawing of it, of those deities. So you can see that long line, and there does seem to be repetition of those, more or less, those 12 deities. There is some sort of slight changes in relation to the two of them, but perhaps this might have been influenced by the Capitium on further along the Via d'Abadanza, or vice versa. We don't know, but certainly the one that's in the area that I focused on in the middle part of the Via d'Abadanza seems to be very much a central focus of those dwellings in that particular area. So this is me just trying to make that link as to where some of those images might appear and what's been preserved today. So again, to reiterate that point, it's just these are the ones that seem to that show those six deities together. This is a further street altar along the Via de Abadanza, but you can see it's not so impressive. It doesn't have deities in there. It just seems to be either priests or um, Guinness that are doing those sort of sacrifice. But you can see the small street altar here at a corner. Nonetheless, still quite impressive what it is. Perhaps a shop sign, perhaps of some gladiators, but it probably is connected to the overall scheme that's taking place in relation to the dwelling itself. So, to try and bring it all together, a lot of these sort of things are quite tenuous, and it is trying to create a little bit of a story and link these little bits and pieces together. So what I'm trying to suggest, because of the absence of evidence of the interior of the dwellings, the point I'm trying to make is the facades seem to show that these are occupants of the household that are very much trying to participate within the community of Pompeii. Maybe taking it a little bit further and saying it's not just with looking at sort of a Pompeian perspective, in terms of looking at some of the temples, the main ancient shrines of Pompeii, the really sort of heart of Pompeii, but also that wider sort of imperial, Julio-Claudian, but also Flavian dynasty. So they're not just people that are seeing themselves in a very insular way. They're seeing themselves as part of their immediate community, but also part of that community of the wider empire. Also, the other point I'm trying to make to you is, unfortunately, quite a lot has been lost. But hopefully, I've made it clear as well, although sort of these sort of tenuous ideas and looking at myth and mythological figures along the doorways, is that Pompeii, the facades have a story onto themselves. That Pompeii, when you visit it today, or well, not today, it's a bit late, tomorrow, was much more colorful. So as you walk through the streets of Pompeii, you really do need to think about using your own senses, not just visually. And when I'm talking about all those colors, you just think about the other elements that we're probably missing in terms of sounds and smells. But really, Pompeii itself is, an exciting dwelling, but it's not just exciting dwelling in terms of people and those sensory elements. It's also exciting in how they're using and thinking about using deities, not just in terms of that probably sort of general worship, but also that sort of personal element, and bringing those links in terms of the facades of their dwellings that might have something not just to do with that religious aspect, but just sort of their sort of their lucky logo or sort of personal images that they've taken on themselves. So thank you very much for staying on longer than I would have hoped, and it's the late sort of start. But if you have any questions now, please do ask. I wasn't able to sort of answer questions as moving along, but hopefully it'll stimulate you to think about how we might look at Pompeii, and in terms of your own sort of work that you might be doing during the year.
So Ardle, I have a question.
Sure.
I don't know whether we would know this, but because of how some of the other cities are in worse states.
Yeah.
Do we think this is particular to Pompeii, or is there evidence of this in Herculaneum, for instance?
There is a single image in Herculaneum. Now, unfortunately, this image, it seems to be not linked with any other images that we can see. It seems to be a very personal deity that's related to Herculaneum, but I think that might be an overinterpretation in relation to that. So it's not just in relation to Pompeii, but it might be something that's quite confined to Campania. So that it's difficult. Unfortunately, when we are looking at Pompeii, we often use Pompeii as sort of a very sweeping generalization, as everything like this was around the Roman Empire. It might be quite specific to Pompeii, and hence, making those connections into Hercules, very personal elements about the tremors and things like that, which I think is quite a nice link. So really the answer is we don't know, but I'm going to ramble on a little bit, but it's a strong possibility. I do know in relation to shop signs, there were some images. It might be linked into some aspects of dwellings in Rome. We know that certain images, for generals, they sometimes had the beaks of ships, and the laurel wreath was sometimes used to decorate the front of houses, and it wouldn't just been, they might have painted it because that's going to preserve a little bit longer. So it could be, if I'm extrapolating a little bit further, something maybe related to Peninsula Italy, but elsewhere, I don't think the evidence is there yet, but perhaps.
Okay, thank you. Wendy has put a question in. What do these various images tell us in terms of the status of the dwellings in that long street and the artists who painted them? Were they a mixed bag?
Yeah, I think I'll go with you and sort of say, like the last points you made there, it's probably a little bit of a mixed bag. A lot of these dwellings don't seem to have the level of embellishment in terms of the like I've showed you the house of the six deities of the beautiful impluvium. It does have a very grand doorway, but the dwelling itself, obviously I would think it's very big, but maybe in terms of Pompeian style, it doesn't seem to be. But if you're looking at the decoration of the doorway in terms of physical bit with the capitals, they sometimes have quite ornate capitals, which is sort of the upper part of the doorway, and that sort of physical stone decoration. These are dwellings that seem to be just a step down from that. But again, it might be one of the problems about preservation, because when we are looking at an awful lot of these dwellings, when we see some of the heights, an awful lot of the upper part of the walls have been reconstructed. So again, we're not necessarily getting a true picture of what the upper part of these doorways are like. So I think it's easier for me to go and say a mixed bag. Um, the Via de Abadanza is sort of seen a little bit more of a commercial street. It's the newish part of Pompeii, closer to the Forum. They're smaller dwellings, but these seem to be a little bit more ornate, and these are the earlier parts of Pompeii. So this might have been where the sort of the the old wealth might have been. Well, this might have been the nouveau riche. People were sort of quite happy to have shops adjacent to them. So yeah, a rambling answer that's not really giving you an answer, but I think it's safest to go along with what you're suggesting there, Wendy, in terms of a mixed bag.
Okay. And Shona, was there a suggestion of a localized form of Venus as can be found elsewhere? I think I saw that one on one of the slides. Also, is it possible that Hercules and Minerva had been long seen as patrons of that area in some sense?
Yeah, I think so. It's possible. The difficulty I have with this is, and I'm sort of making a link in with some of the literary source in terms of mythology, is that these are the sort of latter part of Pompeii. So what I'm doing is the images of frescoes are the latter part, while I'm showing you a really ancient temple. One of the things I forgot to mention, to try to give the impression of how clever I am, is that we need to remember that Hercules has a connection with Minerva, is as being her half brother, and vice versa, half sister, which is something I always tend to forget. Um, so there is that connection. Now, it's a good point in relation to making it sort of very Pompeian Hercules, a Pompeian Minerva, Athena. It seems to be that I don't know whether it's scholarship that's making it. Now, it's something I need to investigate a little bit further now that you're asking the question is maybe they're just trying to make out that this Venus here is very particular to Pompeii because of the colonial bit in terms of Sulla. So they've made it into the Pompeian Venus, but it might just be Venus. Like when you look at some of the early excavation reports and they talk about the color of the lower part of the facade, that red element that I've talked about, that lower part, it's often described as a Pompeian red. So you can imagine now the people who are excavating are very proud of what they're doing. So perhaps it might be an overemphasis on that Pompeian Venus. But these images do seem to show that Venus is significant, Venus is important. That earlier temple that showed you is connected with Venus, the earlier part of Pompeii. So regardless of whether it was a Pompeian Venus or whether it's a Pompeian Hercules, a Pompeian Athena Minerva, clearly it was significant to them, so they made it their own. And that might go back into Wendy's question that we should maybe this is just a little bit of or no, your question actually, sorry. This is a Pompeian thing, or maybe it's a companion thing.
Mm, interesting. Okay, thank you.